Welcome to a special crossover episode of the Geek Warning and Performance Process podcasts. I'm Dave Rome, and this episode I'm joined by Escape's newest contributor, Kevin Benkenstein, aka Blanky. Blanky, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Yourself?
Very well, very well. All right, well, let me continue with the intro, which is that you're based out of South Africa, and when you're not spending your hours on a bike, you're working in a bike shop. And yeah, you're a familiar face within the ultra-distance scene, riding events that see the days become nights and the nights then become the next day. And I've been working with you in the background to get you to share some of your tips on riding further, along with some testing of equipment that leads to the selections for these type of endurance events. Another theme on the list is detailed bike checks specific to bigger goal events on your calendar. And that gets us to the topic of this episode. You've just finished racing the Atlas Mountain Race. What is this crazy event that you've done?
Yeah, it is crazy. It's a remarkable race. First did it 2 years ago and sort of captured my imagination then. And it is a 1,300 kilometer non-stop self-supported bike race through the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. It's 23,000 meters of climbing, 3 checkpoints along the way, so compulsory, well, just check-ins and so that everyone is kept in check. And yeah, it's quite a brutal race covering all sorts of terrain, from sealed roads to good gravel to really bad gravel and the occasional riverbed or destroyed colonial road along the way too. So it really throws everything at you and tests you more or less to your limit.
Okay. You did pretty well this year, tying for third, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct. So
okay.
Very nice result.
Well done. Yeah, I mean, for those that have checked out Escape Collective when they're listening to this, they may know that we've got a bike check article that you've written with images of the bike that you've used and a full run through of all the gear that you've used. This podcast is kind of going to overlap quite closely with that. We're going to talk about all the selections that you made and the thought that went into that. But yeah, if you are listening to this and you're on the free feed of either Performance Process or of Geek Warning, then you'll get about half of this episode. Meanwhile, the full episode is going to be exclusively available to members of Escape Collective, which just so happens to include you, Blanky.
Does.
All right. Well, with that, let's kick on. I guess, yeah, you mentioned the event. What was it? 1,300 kilometers, 1,300 kilometers.
Correct.
2,300 meters of ascent over that distance?
Yeah, 23,000 meters.
23,000. And you were out there for how long?
4 days, 1 hour, 25 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Long enough.
It works out to be what, like 320-ish kilometers every 24 hours over very mixed terrain?
Yeah, it averages that. Climbing, weirdly, averages about a quarter a day as well. So averaging 325 and 6,000 meters a day, mostly on proper mountain biking. So it'll work you.
Wow. Okay. All right. And yeah, so I mean, we covered the terrain. In the end, you ended up picking a full suspension mountain bike for the terrain. But it's not sort of as clear cut. I think there's quite a variety in what people chose to ride and what they chose to not ride. I mean, what was the winner of the men's event on?
Yeah, so the winner of the men's event was on a steel hardtail.
Okay.
I think a 120mm fork. Yeah,
yep.
So
okay.
Not what I chose. And then
yeah, sure.
There was someone on a Canyon Grizzle with Zip Explore wheels and 2.1 tires.
Okay.
So full rigid. I just can't even imagine. And then there were single speed riders. There was a tandem, one tandem that finished. So yeah, there was a real cross section.
Did it finish with both people?
It finished with both people, and they married, which is even more remarkable.
Oh wow! Okay. It's a miracle. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So there really was a huge cross section, and then given the times we live in, there were of course drop bar full suspensions and drop bar hardtails.
Okay.
Yeah. So a bit of everything really.
Yeah, and your bike. I mean, we'll get into the nitty gritty of this, but you basically were on a 120mm travel full suspension mountain bike flat handlebar, but then with like aero extensions out the front to give you an extra position to hold on to.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. Well, I guess 4 days out there. I think it's probably worth noting that you were carrying some things. It's a self-supported event, so I mean, I think what you had to carry or what you ended up carrying plays quite a bit into the bike setup as well. So I mean, what sort of things were you carrying? Like as a basic overview, were you had a tent, that sort of thing, or how much were you carrying?
No, so no tent. I didn't really plan on sleeping outside for any extended periods if I didn't have to. It got down to -4 Celsius at night, so you don't really want to be sleeping in that. And it turned out it was full moon as well. So I know the guys who did sleep outside occasionally struggled to fall asleep because it was too bright. So so you're carrying all your gear. You've got, as cold as it gets, you've got to have really full winter gear. And you can't really let yourself get cold. And obviously, the more fatigued you are, the colder you get. So you dress probably warmer than you would on a normal ride. You've got to carry all your water. If you want to take any food with you, you've got to carry that. You need to be able to carry any electronics that you need, your spares. There's compulsory medical stuff, and some of the gear is compulsory. So you have to carry down jacket, a rain jacket. You have to carry a sleeping bag, and you have to carry a bivvy of some description. So I carried a bivvy bag, not a sort of tent bivvy. But thankfully, my sleeping bag and bivvy weren't used. But I used every single other item of warmth that I had. I think my peak was 6 layers when it was -4, and we're going downhill at like 40 odd k an hour. So then you freeze. So you're carrying, and then obviously water as well and food. So probably at the worst, you've got maybe close to 8 or 9 kilos in my case of extra gear, which definitely played into my choice of bike. As I said, it is of varying surface quality, and sometimes it really is full on like a marathon mountain bike race. And I just felt like my bike handling would be better on a full sus. So I'm 6'4" and 80 kilos. So in a cycling sense, I'm big, which is ridiculous. But I'm definitely heavier than Alex and Benedict, who were first and second, and they're more around that 70 kilo mark. And I knew that. So
gotcha.
I had in my mind that I needed to be fast when it was technical to make up for my relative lack of climbing ability, especially out of the gate. So that pushed me across to the full sus finally. And then, the gear, it's when you don't have suspension at the back and you've got, call it 6 kilos strapped to the back of the bike, or in my case, I had a tail fin aero pack. It definitely affects the handling more on a hardtail, in my experience, than it did in this case with the full suspension. So, I wanted to take.
Why is that? The wheels bouncing with the additional weight, or
precisely, you've got more bounce being a hardtail, and then when it's bouncing, there's more weight going. So I was pretty cognizant of how much of my travel I was using, and you're pretty much always using that full 120 mils, from the first section of the race. So when you consider that there's that much movement going through the rear, if you've got no give, that is bouncing, and that's affecting your handling the whole time. So every time your back wheel bounces, you're forced to go slower. And slower over bumpy terrain is less comfortable. When you get to the 4th day, or, for some riders who are taking 7 or 8 days, when you get to those later stages of the race, all of those micro bounces that are fatiguing, they all add up. And so that fatigue, I mean, in my experience, that goes straight through your back. You just get more and more tired. So, I must say,
it's a lot of energy expended.
Precisely, and a lot of a lot of my decision making is certainly informed by my time on gravel bikes and my semi-recent adoption of believing in gravel forks, and just seeing that the difference that made sort of pushed me over the line with full suspension, because I realized how much little has been going through my arms in those cases, and obviously you can just reverse engineer that to your back. So yeah, so all of those things add up. I mean, it will be different for different riders, and Alex, who won the race, was obviously on a steel hardtail, and so somewhat disproves everything I've just said for his specific case. But he's a different rider. I think
sure,
lighter, possibly better technically. I don't know, and he can make different decisions for himself. So, but where I would consider myself more requiring more assistance from my bike, because I'm probably not as naturally gifted as some of those guys are, especially going uphill. So yeah,
gotcha.
I think that maximize my strengths while minimizing my weaknesses.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that you see hardtails so popular in sort of the ultra events, especially off-road, is just the pure reliability of it. Like, yeah, hardtail's efficient climbing on a perfectly smooth road. There's no suspension losses. It's lighter as well because, maybe a kilogram lighter because you don't have any of the rear linkage, but it's also just the reliability. You don't have the risk of a rear shock losing its air or blowing a rear shock. You don't have the risk of like a pivot bolt breaking and leaving you stranded. I mean, it does happen, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, with all that in mind, like, I guess, yeah, it's probably worth noting that you do have some sponsors that you ride for. Like, you've got, I think Shimano now is on board to support you. You've got a sponsor for your clothing, Chivita, I believe. But you don't have an actual bike sponsor. You don't have a frame sponsor. So what did you decide on and why?
So I chose a Santa Cruz Blur.
Yeah.
I went with a C frame instead of a CC, but to be honest, that was more a pricing decision. And
okay.
I couldn't justify to myself the slight weight benefits when my bike is effectively 18 kilos, maybe at times. It's just seems ridiculous to worry about 200 grams at that stage, at least in that specific space. And then I had a Fox suspension, front and rear, which was entirely a reliability choice from my experience. Obviously, suspension always has a 50 and 150 hour service interval, and my riding time alone was 75 hours. But that 75 hours is pretty intense. 75 hours, definitely more than when you're training at home, and also extremely dusty 75 hours. So I decided that I'd rather save a little bit of money on the frame by getting the cheaper model, although the geometry is obviously the same, and spent a little bit more money on high-end suspension that obviously performs really, really well, and in my experience has been extremely reliable over distance and time. So I went with that. I like the Blur platform because, like, the suspension losses, as you spoke about, versus a hardtail are pretty minimal. It's really good under power, even when open. I did have a lockout, and I used the lockout a lot, maybe sometimes in terrain that you wouldn't expect, but I find that the lockout really, really does help. I mean, the longest sealed section that I can remember was like a 40K, like straight, could see the guy 2 minutes in front of me the entire time. So giving yourself constant time checks, but so that lockout really does help. And then the geometry of a Blur is suitable for me personally. I rode a friend's before I bought it. It's long, but it's not crazy long. I mean, I have very long arms relative to my saddle height, so I mean, even on a long gravel bike, I can still run 100 mil stem, and I had 110 mil stem, which is somewhat ridiculous. I mean, that's very much not what Santa Cruz imagined when they designed the bike.
No.
I think it comes stock with a 60 or 70, even an extra large.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So I've got very long arms, but it's nice and slack up front, but still pedals well. The 120 mil TR version, which is effectively what I ended up building up, really capable in single track. A lot of the time you feel like you're on rails. I did consider other bikes. I think that there are not that many that.
What was on the short list?
The new Epic 8 also 120 mil.
Yeah. Okay.
And I quite like the scalpel as well. Although I won't pretend I can't quite get my head around the lefty fork. It's probably not the only person on earth with that thing.
You don't have to have it. Yeah.
But I would have, suspension wise, I would have done the same. But I did look at those two platforms. If I'm honest, internal routing didn't really excite me because this is not just a bike for one race, obviously. I'm struggling to get my head around internal routing on a mountain bike, even though I do understand it on gravel and road from a purely functional
through
standpoint.
Headset,
Through headset.
Yeah, headset cable routing.
So that probably was one of the factors, but in the end,
Gotcha.
I think the reality about bikes is that if you look at those top end bikes of like a similar travel and from the more mainstream brands, I think that they are all very similar, and it comes down to nuance of what's going to suit for different riders. So that's more or less where I just rode the bike and immediately felt that the fit was good for me and the handling suited the way that I ride. And I think that that's more important than much else,
Yeah, for sure. And that Blur does have, it's one of the longer standing. I think the Epic 8's quite new. The Scalpel's quite new. The Blur, by comparison's, proven in market for the last 3, maybe 4 years now. So,
yeah, for sure.
I mean, it probably is the most proven of the ones you're looking at. So, and it does have a reputation for being pretty solid, pretty bomb-proof. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, so you got the suspension. You went Fox suspension. You had a 34.
Yeah, Fox 34
factory fork on the front, which is pretty.
Yeah, and then on the back, I had the Fox float, also the factory floating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
with a remote lockout.
With a remote lockout, yeah, and I like that remote lockout. Really,
gotcha.
Obviously, they're the obvious areas that it makes a difference, being climbs and tar roads and that sort of thing. But at the same time, there are a lot of, you go through 1,000 dry riverbeds in this race, and every single one has like tire deep sand. So I really like using the lockout into those sandy sections, because especially when you're going down quite a steep dip into it, your fork does, if your suspension is open, your fork has a tendency to dive and you lose speed. So I find that a rigid, for the moment, setup really helps you push through those. And it's, again, just that micro acceleration that you don't have to do. And all of those add up, So I think in road racing, people always say, there are all these micro accelerations in the bunch, and those are actually what kills you. It's not the effort at the end, but you've done all these little 500-watt kicks that you didn't really expect to have to make. And so the same goes through the sand. The more you can eliminate those quick accelerations, especially later in the race when you are quite bad at pedaling, I find that makes a huge difference, and saving momentum is always key.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive to lock out your suspension going into like a compression like that, but it does make sense when you explain it that way. So was there a remote lockout on the fork as well? Like was it one lever doing both, or is that separate?
No, I just ran a 2-position lockout that did fork and rear shock at the same time.
Cool. Okay.
I wanted to minimize, reliability-wise, maybe it's marginally better. I haven't really seen any issues with a 3-position lockout, but it's also just simpler. Just you've got on and off, and suspension is, and like the same goes when you look at gravel bikes. Suspension's pretty good these days, and that 3-position, that when it's open, you're kind of in that middle position the whole time anyway, until you take a big hit. So I haven't noticed a massive difference between 2-position and 3-position, and I didn't see the point of having to think about one more thing.
What was controlling that lockout? Was it a grip shift, or was it more like a Fox style lever?
Yeah, thumb lever.
Gotcha.
I'm quite heavy on my wrist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you're hearing this, then it's a DNF for you. To hear the full episode, including Benky's thoughts on staying comfortable and carrying things, then you'll need to be a member of Escape Collective. Signing up and joining the podcast member feed takes just a couple of minutes, and from there, you'll have access to all that we do at Escape Collective. Hope that you listen to the rest of it soon. Cheers.